Дорогие коллеги, мы продолжаем нашу
Dear
секцию.
colleagues, we continue with our section, and I present our new speaker, Regina Mühlhäuser from the Hamburg. In this topic, sexual violence in armed conflicts, opportunistic acts by individual soldiers or military strategy, the example of the German Wehrmacht in the Soviet Union.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to participate in this program and in this discussion, and I think it's really exciting and inspiring. And I have a little bit of problem with my voice. I'm sick, or just at the end of being sick, so if I lose my voice, please, I'm sorry, then we'll see. So yes, I want to talk about sexual violence in armed conflict today, and I think often we regard sexual violence either as an opportunistic act of individual soldiers or as, on the contrary, a weapon or a strategy of war. So in contrast to this perception, I think recent research, for example, research by Aaron Belkin or Maria Eriksson-Baas or Maria Stern, this research has begun to ask how the behavior of the individual soldier and the war strategy and the considerations of the military commanders are actually intertwined and related. So building on this work, I would actually like to suggest that in order to answer the question whether an army uses sexual violence as a weapon or as a strategy, it ultimately does not matter what the individual soldier's motives are. It doesn't matter why he commits sexual violence or how he justifies his behavior. Rather, I think we have to take into account that military commanders, or the level of the military commanders, so military commanders usually anticipate that this form of violence will happen. They are aware of the behavior of their soldiers. And indeed, we are all aware, because it is part of our everyday knowledge that in times of war, sexual violence will be perpetrated. So consequently, military commanders must calculate with this knowledge. So therefore, as long as they do not take strict action against sexual violence in times of war, in a certain war, military commanders exploit and instrumentalize the behavior of their soldiers for their tactical or strategic interests. So this is what I want to convey today, and I want to try to illustrate that by using the example of the German Wehrmacht during the war in the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945. And I will try to now unfold this argument in three parts, talking first about military culture, second about military cohesion and effectiveness, and third about attacking the enemy. So number one, military culture. So as you know, maybe, the Wehrmacht was a conscript army fielding 17 million so-called citizen soldiers. Approximately 10 million served at the Eastern Front. They came from different social strata and political and religious backgrounds. And the Army High Command faced the task of preparing these men to become direct military actors. So that is to be willing to face two of the most extreme experiences of human existence. That is the power to kill and the possibility of being killed. So the sociologist Ulrich Bröckling has argued that it is part of the men's training in state armies to unleash what he calls individual potential for violence in order to prepare the soldiers for combat. At the same time, however, this very potential has also to be kept under control. And indeed, it has to be channeled towards military goals. Every soldier is therefore subjected to a broad variety of disciplinary measures. The military, as a total institution, generally punishes manifest aberrations more rigorously than other institutions. At the same time, however, it also promises to compensate the individual for the subjugation that it expects. So the literary scholar Jan Philipp Reemtsma has argued that, I quote, "the order, you must, is accompanied by the license, you may." So soldiers are not only disciplined more rigorously than other people, they can also, at least during war, take more liberties. One of the liberties that the Army High Command, as well as the commands of the Navy, the Air Force, and also the SS, one of these liberties that these commands granted their men was that of sexual adventures, and this included the perpetration of sexual violence. Now, of course, as any other army, the Wehrmacht described the rape of women and girls as a crime. But, as Birgit Beck found, the Wehrmacht courts only prosecuted sexual assault in cases in which it was considered a grave disciplinary problem or in which it was sought to cause serious harm to the reputation of the armed forces. This did then not mean that they recognized the criminal nature of sexual violence as such. And furthermore, as the war on the Eastern Front grew in brutality, in particular after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, at that time, military jurisdiction over rape was hardly implemented at all anymore. So this lack of prosecution created a culture of impunity in which sexual violence became a privilege and indeed a right for the soldiers. Evidence of this can be found on different levels. The sexual availability of women and girls, for example, was a central trope of soldier stories. It was disseminated in songs, in jokes, on cards, in magazines. And in the male culture of the army, the notion that soldiers had discretionary power over women of the enemy appeared to be a virtually self-evident fact. Many of the Wehrmacht soldiers, we also have to take into account, they're really very young men, and they had no sexual experience. So regardless of what ideas they had before their deployment, their military deployment, in their further development, sexuality became coded with scoring and killing, with wounded and dead bodies. So a number of contemporary ego documents by German soldiers indicate that the men did not perceive seizing women as a wrongdoing, let alone a crime. Let me give you one example. Willy Peter Reese, born 1921, he jotted down his experiences as soldier of the Heeresgruppe Mitte in his diary. In one passage, he described a drinking spree with his unit in September 1943, close to Gomel in Belorussia. So he wrote, "We sang over red wine and liquors, vodka and rum. We plunged into intoxication like doomed men. We drank and danced, talked with drunken voices about scholarship and eroticism. We made grotesque speeches about war and peace, danced in the railway cars and fired into the air, made a Russian woman prisoner dance naked for us, greased her breasts with boot polish, got her drunk as we were, and only sobered up when we reached Gomel after 5 days." So even though Reese was quite critical of many of the things he and his comrades did, he does not seem to have perceived the women's abasement as an act of violence. His flowery narrative does not reveal is how and by whom their prisoner was forced to dance naked, and what happened beyond that. In his study on ego documents from Thomas Kühne, has demonstrated that drinking together and sharing sexual stories and experiences in the small units of the Wehrmacht could affirm and renew the camaraderie between the men. So Kühne writes, showing off was as much part of assimilation into a community of male bodies as was affectionate homoeroticism. So that means taking female positions in caring for each other. In this way, the men demonstrated social sovereignty of the leagues of males, their superiority over women, the family and home, over civilian society and civilian morality. What becomes clear is that there was a tacit agreement, a particular knowledge among military men, according to which sexual violence was perhaps a not nice, but somehow natural part of warring. Overall, the men had little sense of injustice. Only if an act of violence was accompanied by particular brutality, or if it violated military discipline, was it recognized as a crime. Part 2, military cohesion and effectiveness. So military sociology has explored the ways in which social cohesion determines the effectiveness of military operations. Indeed, soldiers' survival largely depends upon trust and teamwork. Guy Siebold distinguishes between A, peer, and B, leader bonding. So peer bonding, he says, is among members at the same military hierarchical level. So for instance, unit members. And leader bonding is between those at different levels. So unit members and their leaders. So correspondingly, Wehrmacht officers aimed to create an atmosphere in which their men could bond on the one level with each other and at the same time remain loyal to their superiors. In this negotiation process, granting subordinates the liberty of sexual violence could fulfill a particular function. On 7th October 1941, Generalmajor Jürgen W., artillerist with the 20th Infantry Division, made a note of a military victory of his battalion in the territory of Navla in Russia. So I quote, "The village is cleansed in a sharp attack as if on the training ground. The 6th Company proceeds, takes 120 prisoners and a lot of loot. They also capture a trailer with ladies for the brave Russians, but the inhabitants are slightly damaged by the MG fire. But then why do they go to war? Tasty girls is what the privates have to say when they return." So Jürgen W. condoned the behavior of the soldiers and could thus describe himself as a father-like figure who displayed benevolent understanding for the men under his command. In fact, commanding officers who were willing to hold offenders to account or were otherwise regarded as harsh risked losing the loyalty of their men. Anticipation of sexual violence and a sympathetic understanding for offenders can also be found on the level of the Supreme Command. On 6 September 1941, Supreme Commander of the Army, Walter von Brauchitsch, disseminated his rules of action entitled Self-Discipline among the troop leaders on the Eastern Front. And I quote, "Since the predispositions of men differ, it is inevitable that tensions and distress in the sexual realm will arise here. This problem can by no means be solved with a ban on sexual activities. Besides other negative consequences, such a ban would increase the number of sexual violation crimes and the risk of offenses against paragraph 175. So paragraph 175 was the statutory offense of sodomy of homosexual encounters. So von Brauchitsch assumed that depending on their individual disposition, men would build up sexual tensions and distress. And indeed, This was military knowledge at the time. It included an awareness of the potential effects of war brutality on men's soldiers, on men's sexuality. So after World War I, for example, German soldiers' impotence and failure to perform sexually, as well as unwanted sexual arousal during fighting on the battlefield, both of these subjects had become a subject of military and medical discourse. So this was actually the military command was already preoccupied with the sexuality of their soldiers. So underlining his understanding for the sexual concerns of his men, von Brauchitsch instructed military judges to exempt rapists from serious punishments unless they were known to be repeated offenders or an act was carried out with extreme brutality. And furthermore, von Brauchitsch suggested that medical supervised Wehrmacht brothels should be established to limit the military and the medical risks of sexual contact. So indeed, in March 1942, the chief medical officer within the Army High Command ordered the establishment of brothels for the use of Wehrmacht soldiers. So the organization of these brothels varied from region to region, depending on the area, on the strategies of occupation politics, on the degree of collaboration with the local authorities, on the degree of resistance in the local area. To date, the circumstances under which the women were recruited are largely unknown. Apparently, some women were forced into sexual enslavement, others agreed to work in the brothels in exchange for money and protection. So, lots more to say about this, but I don't want to do this now. Here I want to keep in mind what becomes clear is that the army leadership of the Wehrmacht condoned sexual activity, including sexual violence, and even engaged in institutionalized sexual violence in order to provide their men with outlets for what they thought to be their sexual troubles and distress, and to keep up their spirits and to secure the cohesion of the troops. And I come to part 3, destroying the enemy. So the German Wehrmacht led the war against the Soviet Union with unprecedented relentlessness from the very first day. Contemporary and post-war eyewitness accounts, as well as official military documents, indicate that sexual violence was part of the German military's Eastern campaign during all phases. Forms of sexual violence encompassed enforced nakedness, sexual blackmail, sexual torture, rape with objects or body parts, genital rape, gang rape, sexual enslavement, enforced prostitution, genital mutilation. In particular, in the first phase of the war, women and girls appear to have been targeted indiscriminately. Furthermore, men and boys could and did also become victims of sexual violence. They came from all social, national, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. They included non-Jews as well as Jews. As one woman who experienced the German conquest in Ukraine remembered, and they did whatever they wanted to here. They took our hope chest. They came in quickly and asked for eggs and milk, yelling, screaming, running after girls, taking everything. The effects of this form of violence were devastating. Many women and girls went into hiding in order to avoid sexual attacks. Ego documents and testimonies by victims and bystanders reveal that such acts resulted in feelings of essential loss, insecurity, and terror. Some survivors have also testified that they felt scared and ashamed and concealed their experiences from their families, friends, and communities, in particular from their husbands and fiancés. So the social consequences of this form of violence were devastating. But this, I'm coming back to the perspective from the German army side. So this might not have been a prime motivator for the soldiers who perpetrated these acts of sexual violence, or for the military commanders to condone or encourage them. However, on both levels, the individual soldiers and the military command were, of course, aware of this kind of effects and of the fatal individual and social consequences of sexual violence. On August 10th, 1941, the command of the 9th Army reported that the number of sexual crimes in the combat zone was significant. Merely in cases in which German soldiers were growing wild and morally decadent, and in which they lacked discipline, rigorous action should be taken. So these guidelines actually worked in accordance with the Kriegsgerichtsbarkeitserlass, which stipulated, and I quote, the judge orders, so this is a court-martial order, the judge orders the prosecution of offenses against civilians through court-martial only if it is considered necessary for the maintenance of the discipline or the security of the troops. This applies, for instance, to cases of serious offenses which are based on carnal self-indulgence, which derive from a criminal tendency, or which are a sign that the troop threatens to grow morally decadent. So this court-martial order reveals that criminal offenses against civilians, including rape, were generally regarded as legitimate. Merely in cases in which soldiers lost sight of the German military aims, lacked self-control and military discipline, and acted primarily in order to satisfy their personal lusts or to enrich themselves, merely in these cases should they be subjected to military jurisdiction. Besides this non-persecution, sexual violence was also actively encouraged. On 16th December 1942, for example, the Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht, Wilhelm Keitel, stipulated that all troops active in the fight against partisans would, and I quote, have the right and the duty to use any means in this battle, also against women and children, if it only leads to success. So the main message of this decree was unambiguous. Warfare against partisans did not call for any scruples, not even when it came to women and children. It might not have been explicitly verbalized order to perpetrate sexual violence, but the wording certainly conceded that the combatants had the power of discretion and would go unpunished. What becomes clear is that the Wehrmacht Command not only tacitly condoned, but in certain situations more or less openly encouraged their behavior. So let me conclude. The example of the Wehrmacht's actions during the war and genocide in the Soviet Union demonstrates that while military rules and laws to restrict uncontrolled sexual behavior existed, the implementation of these regulations was structured such that rape only became a subject of disciplinary action or prosecution if the specific acts were regarded as counterproductive to military aims. So this lack of prosecution created a culture of impunity in which sexual violence became a privilege and indeed a right for the soldiers. And soldiers used this space to interpret the event and act in accordance with social values, their personal inclinations, the norms that emerged within their small units, and the opportunities which were presented to them in specific situations. And while aware of the potential hygienic and disciplinary dangers of uncontrolled sexual violence, the Wehrmacht did very little to stop it and, in fact, exploited the behavior of its men for strategic purposes. Furthermore, the Wehrmacht organized the institutionalized exploitation of women in brothels in order to provide their men with outlets for sexual troubles and distress, and to minimize the risk of sexually transmitted diseases. So permitting sexual violence served different functions inside the larger campaign of the War of Annihilation. First, I think it fostered the cohesion in the small military units and the loyalties towards the superiors in ways that secured military power. Second, it degraded local women and destroyed social ties in the victims' communities, and thus it communicated conquest. Third, it became a means to dehumanize the Jews and to create a distancing effect towards them that facilitated the genocidal killings. The Wehrmacht leadership, I think, fostered an understanding of male sexuality as something that needed an outlet and that could and should be capitalized on productively during the war. High and mid-level commanders anticipated the sexually violent behavior of their men in the field and exploited it for their military aims. And I think, for very last word, this is something that we can observe not only in this war, but similar mechanisms we can also see in other wars and armed conflicts. The fact that rape is pervasive in many civil societies and that there continues to be a widespread lack of awareness that this form of violence constitutes a crime, this creates conditions in which sexual violence in times of armed conflict is deemed as a normal and acceptable, ultimately, behavior. So as long as military commanders do not take active and strict measures to curtail sexual violence, they are utilizing this for their tactical and strategic thinking, even in cases in which rape is not openly communicated, let alone ordered. So in this sense, I think wartime sexual violence is always a military weapon. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Регина, за...
Thank you so much, Regina, for your interesting and problematic report. Are there any questions, dear colleagues? Yes, Irina Dmitrievna. Regina, thank you so much for your wonderful report, for your wonderful speech. Am I right in understanding that the instructions that would be limiting the violence in the German army in the Eastern Front were different from the Western Front? For example, when Germans entered Paris, were there any cases of uncontrolled violence, or it was forbidden? To what extent the Eastern Front was different in atrocities and in the allowances for the army which were made, and in what way violence was limited in the Western European countries? Is there any information about that?
Yes, concerning, thank you very much. Concerning the sexual violence in particular, the measures potentially were the same. When the Wehrmacht went to the Eastern Front and also at the beginning of the war in the Soviet Union, actually they took measures. They took measures that they had circulated among the Western Front in France years before, and they took these and just circulated them among the commanders at the Eastern Front also. So potentially the measures that forbid sexual violence and that they were the same actually, but the way these were spelled out were very different. I cited the court-martial order. The court-martial order was only extended or was only implemented in the territory of the Soviet Union. So the whole criminal endeavor in that sense, and the way that the Wehrmacht allowed violence, and then including sexual violence in the Soviet Union, was on a much larger scale. So they communicated to their soldiers impunity on a completely different level. And of course, at the Western Front, they wanted to a certain extent establish a collaboration regime. So the court cases, the Wehrmacht court-martial cases on sexual violence were more, and the sentences for the soldiers, for perpetrators, were actually higher. So as I already mentioned in my paper, in the Soviet Union, in Poland, it was a little bit different, but you can see the development during the war in Poland. You see how the sentences get less and less, and how and it depends on territory, of course, and also that there were not much sentences anymore. So in the Soviet Union, actually, we know of very, very little court cases, so not much was going on in that respect.
Thank you so much. We have more questions. Игорь Кобылин.
Спасибо. Насколько я понял,
Thank you. As I understood, women and even young men, independently on the territory of the Soviet Union, independently of race and religion. And Wehrmacht didn't want to react. But were they spoken or unspoken taboos for the sexual contact with the lower races? Whether the racial prejudices influenced Wehrmacht, depending on in relation to the sexual violence?
Yes, thank you very much. Very important question also, of course. The law of race defilement, so that it was forbidden to have sexual contact between so-called Aryan and so-called Jews, was at first limited to within the borders of the Reich, the law. But in the occupied territories and also in the Soviet Union, the military, of course, took certain rules and regulations from that and communicated to their soldiers that sexual violence against Jewish women is forbidden. But the soldiers, in particular in the Soviet Union, from my sources, from what I found, did not take this very seriously. Some, I think, did. Others did not, and they talked among themselves. I have some sources for that. That in particular in the Soviet Union, the laws of race defilement didn't exist because, and I think that was the mindset, that in this war, this was a war of annihilation of the Jews. So in this sense, it didn't play a role anymore. So race defilement was important within the borders of the Reich, where you had to, measure out who has contact with whom, and so on and so on. So during this war of annihilation, it wasn't a big subject anymore. And in fact, I did not find any, which means it doesn't mean it, maybe it exists somewhere, but I did not find one single court case regarding race defilement in the Soviet Union.
There is the question of Arseny Kumanko. Dr. Mühlhäuser, thank you so much for your speech and for your work and for your books about this most important topic. I wanted to ask a question that in a way continues the previous questions by Irina Dmitrievna and Igor Kobylin. If we take into consideration certain differences as to how sexual violence functioned in different scenes of military scenes of different warfares of the Second World War, and whatever you answered when answering Igor's question and what you mentioned in your speech, can we say that sexual violence was a pre-calculated instrument, pre-calculated by the Supreme Commandment, the Supreme Commanders, the instrument of warfare against the subjugated the nations, or it was practiced but wasn't seen as a subject of any specific reflection that could be fixed in some documents and some special instructions. What was it? What was this? Is there any shade of governing of social activities, precalculation of it? That it can be a soldier's necessity to do it, and the army commanders have to react it, or this is a premeditated. There is a planning here, and there are special documents about that, laws.
I think that's a question at the center of things, and that's what you usually don't find. Even in wars that we say, for instance, in the former Yugoslavia, we don't find written orders. There's no order that, there's no document in that sense that says, okay, now the soldiers are supposed to go out to rape. So this is not what we are looking for. Still, or this is not how we can understand this. So the question is, from my point of view, much more, how is this communicated within the military formation? So how is it communicated from top down and from down to the top in that sense? And I think we do find in some situations something, I think you used the term pre-calculated planning or something like that. So we do find commanders who order their men to get them women, to order their men to go out and talk and get in contact with local collaborators or something to get women to them, and so on. So we do find these situations. But of course, this is not an order that comes from the high command. This is something that happens on the mid-level command, and only in specific situations and due to the way that particular military commanders on the mid-level understand their role, of course. But I think still you can say the Wehrmacht worked with something that was called, in German it's called Auftragstaktik. So this means that the Wehrmacht High Command didn't give concrete orders to their men. They just, to their mid-level commanders, they just communicated the goal. This should be the goal. So the soldiers were supposed to, it was in their idea how to fulfill these goals. And I think in that sense, sexual violence could be part of the game. So it could be part also of the communication. But then we have to ask, how does the communication work? And I think in my paper I cited Keitel, and he says, don't have any mercy even with women and children. And then, of course, we cannot see this as an order, but at the same time, we can say, well, this comes back to the everyday life, because in the everyday life, sexual violence is, in the everyday pre-war society in Germany, sexual violence is also a more or less normal form of violence. So if you say don't have mercy with the women and children, it is, I think, a specific message carried and communicated from top to down. So I think my argument is that we have to look much more, what does it mean on these different levels of different hierarchical levels and the communication, and that we cannot stand with looking for the orders. If we say we look for the orders and there are no orders, and this means it is not part of a plan, I think we are going into the wrong direction. We are not confronting the realities.
Thank you very much.
Да, Регина, спасибо большое. У нас остается...
Thank you, Regina. We don't have much questions, but there are YouTubes. If any allied forces and the US included towards other women and the women and their own women, if there is any research about allied forces, including the USSR.
Yes, I think recently it has been not a very well researched subject, but there's more and more coming out as more and more research coming out. For instance, by Mary Lou Roberts on the American forces in France, or by Miriam Gebhardt on the Allied forces in Germany, or there's much more work. But by now I think we are getting on a level where we are saying, okay, different armies actually behave differently. How can we see the differences and the similarities? So I think that's something that's coming out right now.
Да, Ирина Дмитриевна еще...
Irina Dmitrievna has a commentary as well. You delicately diverged from the subject of USSR sexual violence in Germany. It was a large-scale violence. But can we see that this tactics is of almost spoken out allowance of this Soviet violence in Germany was the un-Soviet answer to the German violence in the USSR? It was justified by the idea of revenge and was a cynical way of taking out the stress. This story of the mutual violence, how we can see that? How we can talk?
I think it's always difficult for me to say because I don't speak Russian. So I think some researchers have exactly made this argument that the Soviet soldiers in Germany reacted to the brutal German campaign, and it was kind of a revenge question also. So I just, in that sense, I can just believe what they say, but I don't really know. I mean, there has been a lot of work recently also coming out in different languages. I don't really have a fixed position on that. I think it would be worth to have a current literature review to know what is going on. I think in the German debate, it is very interesting because the German debate is not so much concerned with how do the Russians or the Soviet, how does the Soviet army, the different levels, how do they act and react? But much more on the question, how are they perceived and what is the ideas that the Germans have? And there it is this is also what you say is also a big subject. It's always the question, was it revenge, or is it a question of there's also this idea that the men who came to Berlin first were very young and very, what was their position actually in this whole debate? So I think this is a different debate, which needs more nuance.
Да, спасибо большое. У нас есть время.
Thank you so much. The last question, the final question. Johannes Schwarz wants to ask this question. Johannes, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you well. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I have a question, Regina, concerning the differences of German behavior in the occupied countries like France and Russia. There was already a question on this subject. I've read the book by Richard Feynman, who says that the German soldiers in France behave very differently concerning the social classes in France. So, for example, if they met aristocratic family, they behave very correctly, very respectful. And most of the sexual violence in France, there was testified in neighborhoods in Paris where were a lot of prostitutes, and there was also a lot of sexual violence. So can you, if you compare it to Russia, do you find the same differences of the German behavior towards different social classes?
That's a really difficult question. As I said before, I don't speak. Can you hear me? I don't speak.
Yes, I can hear you.
I neither speak Russian nor any Eastern European language, so it's really hard for me to say what actually happens. But from the way the soldiers describe themselves, of course, there are big differences, and it seems as if, for example, it depends on how, or there are big differences in the way they assess what they see. And there seems to be a difference, for example, of course, about the countries. Is this in the Baltic states, in Ukraine, or in Russia? Then there's also on the level of wealth, for instance, in the countryside, they often talk about women in the countryside as particularly, how should I put this? As particularly weak and easy to have, kind of this thing. I found that, but I mean, I have my idea was actually to. Or what I looked at was I looked at different soldiers' narratives, and I tried to access somehow what actually. So I think or to put it differently, I think with my sources I really cannot answer that question, because I can say how they talked about different women in different areas or something, but it's not systematic. And I'm by now, up to now, I only interpret it in the sense of different units. So different units have different perceptions regarding where they go and where they come from, and about the culture in particular units. So that is something that in my sources appear very strong, that some units develop something like a really sexual violent culture. They are in this male community of this small unit. They are the way they talk about women can be very aggressive and very violent, and you don't find that in the sources of other units. So I think this is more my approach, but that doesn't mean the other thing doesn't play a role. I can't answer that question in that sense. I hope somebody can answer it. I think it would be an interesting future project.
I'm sorry, speaking about the Soviet Union and about different classes, we should bear in mind that at that time the upper classes were communists.
Right.
Some I'm afraid there were no courtesy towards them, I would say, from the German soldiers, because the social structure of the Soviet Union was absolutely differed greatly from France and many other Western countries.
That is true, but you have to say, of course, you're right, but you have to say that in the descriptions of the soldiers, they try to make out differences. So it's their way of approaching things. So that's.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt the discussion, but we have to go further. Thank you, Regina, very much for your paper and for the discussion.